Welcome back to the Ready for Merge show. I'm your host, Christine D. Kim. And normally I would say that this is your biweekly brief, updating you on the main developments of Bitcoin and Ethereum development. But this week, we're actually going to be taking a break from the normal show programming and dive pretty deep into an important decision that's upcoming in Ethereum's development. And that is the Hegota consensus layer headliner selection. Today's show is going to be all about the Hegota headliners. And to do this show, I have two special guests with me. First is Jihoon Song, a researcher of the Ethereum Foundation who's on the protocol prototyping team. He is the FOCIL EIP champion. We also have Leo, who is the founder and the research lead at Miga Labs. He's the 2D PeerDAS EIP champion. So we really only have two proposals. We have FOCIL and we have 2D PeerDAS. It's a very small pool of proposals this time around for Hegota. Let's just start off the show by introducing these two proposals and what they do. Leo, could you kick us off with the 2D PeerDAS proposal that you're championing?
So the idea is right now we have PeerDAS, which is a one-dimensional scheme, and the whole idea of this 1D PeerDAS is to offer data availability for rollups to put the data that they need for scalability. Now, the scheme that we have today works fine, but it's not the original idea that we initially thought for data availability sampling. We initially thought about a two-dimensional scheme that offers much more robustness and reliability because we wanted to go step by step and do changes incrementally. We decided to first implement a one-dimensional approach that was simpler and much more approachable, and then move on to the two-dimensional full DAS. And so we implemented PeerDAS for Fusaka that is already running and is working well. And the next fork is Glamsterdam, and it's going to be too soon to implement two-dimensional PeerDAS for Glamsterdam. So my idea is that I think Hegota is the good time for extending PeerDAS to a full two-dimensional.
When you say we and building PeerDAS, does Miga Labs have a client that they build out implementations of PeerDAS? What is Miga Labs' stake in wanting to get 2D PeerDAS fully implemented?
So I have been participating on this research since 2022. We started working on data availability sampling with the researchers from the Ethereum Foundation, Dan Rad, and at the moment it was also Danny at the EF. And we started working on the research for data availability sampling. And we started exploring, even other researchers in the EF, and we started exploring the trade-offs between one-dimensional versus two-dimensional data availability sampling. This decision, actually, I remember the decision to implement the one-dimensional first was taken at the DevConnect in Istanbul. So that was in 2023. So that was quite some time ago. And when I say we, I mean all the Ethereum researchers and core developers that have participated in this research and that have been contributing to this research.
Jihoon, as a researcher yourself at the foundation, tell us a little bit about why you're championing FOCIL and what it does.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm not the only champion. I'm one of champions that who have been pushing FOCIL. So we've been running with FOCIL quite a long time, but if I were to do it once again, FOCIL significantly improves the quality for transaction inclusion by allowing multiple validators to voice in block building. So FOCIL introduces a new committee. It's an IL inclusion list committee. It takes 16 validators from all beacon committees per slot. And inclusion list committee members produce inclusion lists. It's the list of transactions that we expect to see in the payload. So if you see a payload that misses any of inclusion list transactions that could have been appended at the end of the payload, you're not going to test for it, which will end up reorging that payload. So if you're a proposer or a builder, you should produce a payload that satisfies the inclusion list constraints. If you're on a tester, you want to listen to inclusion lists over the peer-to-peer network and validate if a payload is inclusion list compliant. If you're an inclusion list committee member, you should produce an inclusion list based on your view on the public mempool. So the trade-offs of this design are it adds some complexity to the protocol because it adds something, so it adds non-zero complexity. Secondly, it doesn't support block transactions. Last but not least, inclusion list broadcast consumes some network bandwidth, which is amounted to 1 blob in most of the cases, and 2 blobs if all inclusion list committee members equivocate.
When you say equivocate, what does that mean?
So if an inclusion list committee members produce 2 inclusion lists instead of 1, then we are calling it equivocation. And this is something that we don't want to have in the protocol. So in that case, we're going to ignore all inclusion lists for that committee member for that slot.
I see. I'm under the impression that this FOCIL change is only really going to impact a very, very small percentage of transactions in the mempool. Also, given that not a lot of transactions are even still perhaps going to move through the mempool in the future if everyone's using private mempools to protect themselves from things like front running and sandwiching. Do you think that FOCIL is important to prioritize now, given how the effects of censorship on Ethereum are quite, at least the ones that FOCIL targets in the public mempool are quite small?
So yes, that's a valid concern, but I do believe that it is the right time to implement FOCIL in the protocol because first off, credible neutrality is important. With FOCIL, Ethereum no longer have to rely on altruism or human decision, whether it be political or economical. So we are seeing very little censorship today, arguably, but that's because top builders decide to not censor transactions from public mempool or private mempool, I'm not sure. And when it comes to block transaction, active research is still ongoing to figure out how we can include block transaction in inclusion list. And from what I can tell, I don't know, probably in few years, we can figure out how to actually implement blob inclusion list transaction. So it's related to blob research, and there are many research are going on that side, including efficient blob propagation. So as we keep scaling, the centralization force toward sophisticated actors is increasing, and FOCIL prevents these actors from censoring transactions that could have been landed in the block without any issue. So that kind of a guarantee is a significant to uphold credible neutrality of Ethereum.
So I think I agree with Jihoon in many things. I think inclusion lists are important. I do think that it's important to guarantee censorship resistance. So I don't see the two different headliners as conflicting. I think they both involve the same vision for Ethereum, which is scalability, credible neutrality, decentralization, on all of that. So I think we have the same vision. So I think it's just a matter of sequencing. What should come first? What should we prioritize for this specific hard fork? But I do agree with most of the things that Jihoon said. I do think it's important to focus on scalability and in particular two-dimensional PeerDAS for Hegota because we are seeing a blob scaling happening in front of our eyes. We had BPO1 happening in December, BPO2 happening in January. We are increasing the number of blobs, and I am afraid that by the time we reach Hegota, we will be having so many blobs, and we will be still using a one-dimensional scheme that is, I think is at the limits of what it can offer in terms of resilience and robustness. So I think we need to change to the two-dimensional PeerDAS before we reach that scalability limit. So the two-dimensional PeerDAS headliner that I'm proposing is all about scalability, and I think Hegota is the right time for it before it becomes too late. I think the next fork might be too late because we will start seeing the limits of the scheme, the one-dimensional scheme that we are using right now.
So I also agree that scaling is still very important. And 2D PeerDAS would make block scaling easier. But the point that I want to make is that the scaling is not the only thing that we should try to achieve. And we want to scale Ethereum without losing the values that we care about. And one of them is definitely credible neutrality. And that's becoming more and more important where more users and institutions are onboarding onto blockchain. And it might vary depending on who you ask. From how I understand why FOCIL was pulled out of Glamsterdam was because of the testing complexity, because EPBS is already huge change, and both EPBS and FOCIL touches fork choice, which is notorious of testing. And that was the main reason, one of the main reasons that we pulled FOCIL out of Glamsterdam. And when we talked to developers and researchers, people generally agreed with the fact that we need FOCIL now, because if we delay FOCIL once more, it will be at least 1 year out. Then we might end up sitting in a landscape that is quite different from what we have today. So I do think it is the right time to shift FOCIL. And yeah, and FOCIL already demonstrates very good technical readiness. So yeah.
It does kind of seem like FOCIL is a bit more ahead in terms of implementation readiness than 2D PeerDAS. Leo, can you speak to any kind of client implementations or testing progress as it relates to 2D PeerDAS?
Yeah, I understand that. It does look like that. And the funny thing is that actually 2D PeerDAS was the original proposal. Actually, the one that surprised us all was the one-dimensional version of it. But I guess at this point, everybody is familiar with the 1D and nobody knows about the 2D, or maybe just a few people that were following some of the talks long time ago. But yeah, I mean, in terms of implementation of two-dimensional PeerDAS, we don't see any implementation in any client so far, but we do have multiple research prototypes that are already implemented two-dimensional PeerDAS. We understand how it works. We measure the trade-off. In terms of research, we have a lot of code that has already been produced for two-dimensional PeerDAS, and a lot of research reports and results that have been gathered through the years. There is also another thing that I want to mention. We have seen the development of partial messaging, and this is something that is being implemented in Lead Peer-to-Peer right now. So cell-level messaging is kind of goes hand in hand with the two-dimensional PeerDAS scheme, and that is being implemented right now. Whether we go for 2D or not is irrelevant. We will have partial messaging happening rather soon. I think probably even before Glamsterdam. So this is happening, and there are other EIPs that are proposing also different ways of managing the blob mempool that I think will go very well with the two-dimensional PeerDAS as well. So I don't know whether they will be implemented for Amsterdam or for Hegota or not, but they have already been proposed and there are already studies about those. So there's also that. And one last thing that is already being implemented is GetBlobs version 3. So it's the new version of GetBlobs. So this is the communication between the execution layer and the consensus layer, which will allow us to get data from the blob mempool into the consensus layer custody in a much more efficient way than going through the network. So there is a lot of things that are already ongoing that I think we will have, and this is all independent of hard forks, whether it's Glamsterdam or Hegota or any other. So I think there are already a lot of things that are moving forward that are getting us closer to two-dimensional PeerDAS. And one last thing that I want to mention is that two-dimensional PeerDAS is not only important for scalability, but it's also important for decentralization. Right now, we are heavily relying on supernodes to reconstruct data. Basically, any full node that is not a supernode cannot reconstruct data. You need to have half of the columns, basically all the columns, half of the columns to reconstruct data and to provide that reconstruction to the network. So we are kind of in a scenario where we have, I'm not going to say a centralized network, but we are relying heavily on supernodes. And this is not good. And this is also important for the vision of Ethereum of credible neutrality. We don't want to rely on a few big actors. We want that anyone in the network can participate in reconstructing data in a symmetric way. So I think that's why it's important. But yeah, there are many things that are already moving forward. And I thought there is no implementation of two PeerDAS right now. There are a lot of pieces that are already moving ahead.
Yeah, and to confirm, supernodes are the nodes on Ethereum that have the maximum effective balance of stake, correct? 1,248 ETH or something like that.
Actually, you can decide to be a supernode even if you don't have a huge effective balance. You could even decide to be a supernode without even having one validator. You just need to trigger the flag in your node, and that's it. So for example, if you run a node explorer, like we do at Miga Labs, we want to have as much data as possible, and we want to have perhaps all the blobs and all the columns. So we can just turn the flag on, and we become a supernode. Anybody can become a supernode. However, what you say is also right. If you have a large number of validators, you have to be a supernode. You need to download a large number of columns, and then basically you have all the blob data, and then you can reconstruct anything.
I see. So it's more about like the resources, like the bandwidth and the computational resources that you're consuming as a node.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Well, it's a good point that you raise because even without 2D PeerDAS, there are the cell data delta columns, the get blobs v3, all these optimizations happening to PeerDAS to get Ethereum ready for BPO3, the next blob capacity increase. So it's not as though developers are not scaling their layer 2 capacity. We are recording this podcast on Tuesday, February the 17th, and the CL headliner selection decision is anticipated to happen this Thursday on the All Core Developers Consensus Call. The last consensus call, I'm afraid to say, Leo, I mean, all developers were very, very in consensus about basically confirming FOCIL as the Hegota headliner. I want to talk about where we think the decision is going to land this upcoming Thursday. I mean, Jihoon, how confident are you based on your conversations and the outreach that you've done over the last couple of weeks since that call? How confident are you that FOCIL is going to be selected as the headliner?
So, as Leo said, I also think that there are many research and development going on to improve blob propagation. But I am quite confident that FOCIL will be the CL headliner for Hegota. We've been running with FOCIL for a long time, and we haven't reached to interop across all clients, but we had 8 clients out of 11 clients interop. Sorry, not interop, but 8 clients have prototype. It means there are 8 teams that have knowledge on how to implement FOCIL. And that brings us a lot of advantage when it comes to technical readiness. So core devs have agreed that we need FOCIL, and the question was how. Now that it's about to find its place as a headliner for Hegota, I think its FOCIL time has come.
That is what developers were saying on the last AC/DC call. Leo, was that your impression as well?
Yeah, I think FOCIL has been discussed for a long time. I was there also for the decision, for when the decision to drop FOCIL from Glamsterdam happened, and I was actually surprised that that happened. So I agree that that's more or less the feeling. But I have all confidence on the core developers and researchers of Ethereum. So I think they will take the right choice. The objective is not to force to the PeerDAS in whatever fork, but to responsibly move scalability forward for Ethereum. And so I guess the objective will be to see what parts of two-dimensional PeerDAS can be implemented without a fork, or perhaps in smaller EIPs, so that parts of those could be included in Hegota, maybe even some of them, small ones in Glamsterdam, if that's not too late. But yeah, I guess the idea would be to try to move forward scalability as much as possible in the most responsible way, so that when the time is appropriate, we switch to the two-dimensional scheme.
Gotcha. Let's just assume that on Thursday's call, FOCIL does get selected as the headliner for Hegota. There is still a pretty big question mark as it relates to the readiness of ePBS, Enshrined Proposer Builder Separation, in Glamsterdam. Is there a chance that Enshrined Proposer Builder Separation actually doesn't make it into Glamsterdam and is pushed into Hegota fork?
Well, when it comes to pulling ePBS out of Glamsterdam, I really don't think that it will gonna happen. It's a headliner, so you don't kick out a headliner from a fork.
The headliner process is a pretty new process in Ethereum governance. We haven't seen the headliner process happen very many times for Ethereum. Are you concerned at all about the timeline for Hegota?
Well, I don't expect to see both Glamsterdam and Hegota in 2026. And from where I stand, I think people are already starting to acknowledging that fact, because Glamsterdam, the first ePBS DevNet has been delayed, and now we are expecting to see the first DevNet around mid-March, I would say, although it is not the consensus. It means we will not gonna be able to ship Glamsterdam in June 2026, which was the original expectation when we talked about Glamsterdam headliner last year. But yeah, then I think the assumption is 2 forks in a year will have to hold in 2026 as well. And I don't know, like it seems like people that I'm working with are already know that Glamsterdam and Hegota cannot happen in the same year. So do you think that we have to ship 2 forks in a year, like in 2026 and 2027 and so on? And is it possible?
That's a good question. I mean, Leo, are you under the same impression that Glamsterdam and Hegota are not going to happen in the same year and Hegota will happen sometime in 2027?
Yeah, this it's hard to predict these things, but yeah, I agree with Jihoon. That is tough. I think people saw what happened in 2025 and they think this is normal. But in reality, part of the reason we could deliver Pectra and Fusaka in 2025 is because we started implementing PeerDAS for Pectra, actually. We started in Kenya, in the interop in Kenya. The initial idea was to have Fusaka for Pectra, and in the end, it didn't happen because we couldn't make it. And so, because we had already so much prior work for Fusaka, then that's the reason why we could deliver 2 hard forks in 1 year. but it's definitely it's hard work. And core researchers are and developers are working as hard as they can to try to implement as many features as possible into Ethereum. But you need to do it in a responsible way. You need to make sure that you are not going to break anything, and that takes a lot of testing. That takes a lot of care, and therefore, yeah. I mean, I understand the idea of trying to ship 2 forks every year, but yeah, there are some changes that are just too big to be delivered in 6 months. So I also see that Hegota could, go to the beginning of 2027.
I think a big reason why developers push themselves so hard to ship 2 forks last year in 2025 was this idea around credible commitments. When developers say that they're going to do something on a timeline, they do it. When they say that they're going to commit to a headliner, they don't take it out at the last minute, what they saw with EOF perhaps, which wasn't really a headliner, but it was a pretty major change that was pulled out last minute. Do you think, Jihoon, that Ethereum developers are capable of giving credible commitments about the evolution of Ethereum, about the protocol development of Ethereum?
So I think the audience should be more than core developers. I would also put researchers in there because we work in tandem, and also people outside of the protocol bubble who care for Ethereum. I mean, basically the Ethereum community. But I think headliner level ideas take a long time to develop. So, like, for example, even just doing the thought exercise of asking what could be the headliner for the upcoming next few forks, um, that's really a good way to shape short-term direction. And I think the benefit of this headliner selection process is once you have such direction, it helps you allocate resources more efficiently. So yeah, I think, yeah, but I wasn't around before the headliner process, so I can't speak to the before and after. But I think it is settling in, and from what I can tell, is helping with resource allocation.
On the topic of it's not just core developers, there's other stakeholders in the Ethereum ecosystem that are collectively driving Ethereum development and Ethereum evolution. Leo, from your perspective, from being part of Miga Labs, rather than the foundation, or rather than, say, a client team like Sigma Prime or, I don't know, like ChainSafe Systems, do you think the headliner selection process has opened up Ethereum development to a wider audience of stakeholder participation?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. And yeah, I was here before the headliner process and all of that. I was also surprised when we started implementing this. I was I was thinking, why do we need to give a direction? I mean, why do we need to decide right now what is going to be the headliner? We can just work on the features that we want to implement, and then when we think they are ready, we can say, this is what is included in this fork. This is what we were doing before, right? But I agree that that could be look as okay. We just ship a bag of EIPs into a hard fork, and I guess the headliner process. I think the intention is to try to explain to the public what is it what we are doing, and what is what we are going to be working on for the next 6 months. And so I guess, yeah, it creates more engagement. And I think it does a good work of transmitting this, process and communicating this process of research and development to the, outer ecosystem beyond core devs and researchers. So I think, yeah, in that sense, I think it's fulfilling its objectives.
Are there any improvements or any like pieces of feedback that you'd like to see implemented for the next headliner selection round?
I can think of 2 points. I think headliner decisions require a lot of attention. So ideally, you want to make those decisions when people aren't under deadline pressure. So for example, deciding headliners for fork n+1 while people are busy with working on fork n is not good. We also want to encourage seniors to weigh in earlier in the process. And on top of that, I think we need better pipelining. If a proposal doesn't make it into this fork, then you are basically back to square one for the next one. And this is actually why for cadence comes into play. If it looks like now or never, then when it comes to sequencing, you wanna ship a proposal that you think it is important for Ethereum. But at the end of the day, we just want to make Ethereum better, and we are on the same side. So shipping fork a little bit faster, it helps everyone to align everyone towards the same goals.
Anything you'd add to that, Leo?
I would say maybe the voting system for when we decide which EIPs should be included or not is still a little bit fuzzy. Most of these things happen in the ACDC calls or ACDE calls, and if for some reason you couldn't make it to the call because you had a doctor appointment or whatsoever, you couldn't defend your EIP or something like that, then the time has passed. It's also sometimes hard for people to talk into these calls because you are with 60 other people that are extremely smart and extremely experienced, and they have a lot of research behind. And sometimes when you are new, you are afraid of talking and giving your opinion because, in addition, it's getting recorded. So if you say something stupid, everybody will notice, and everybody will know on the internet. So I think it's working well, but maybe there are some improvements to do there to provide feedback in different ways, to make the selection process of EIPs maybe a little bit less intimidating than just raising your voice into an ECDC call. I guess there are some ways to do that. You could interact in the repositories. You can interact in the ETH research post that publish the research about the EIP or the Ethereum Magician post. So I guess there are some ways to interact other than just the ECDC call. But yeah, I still think the way the decisions are taken is still a little bit kind of fuzzy.
One of the suggestions for improvement that I've heard recently and that a lot of Ethereum community members have been talking about was one by Tomasz, who is now the former executive director of the Ethereum Foundation. And he was saying that, from EIP, the process of even proposing your EIP to getting it reviewed, to getting it approved in the EIP repository, and then to scope out an Ethereum upgrade, that should all just be done via AI. So from start to finish, from scoping to execution, to have AI driving development. What are your guys' view on that future? Is that a material improvement?
I think in the short term, we would want to have a control and to steer Ethereum toward good design, such as the one that implements the value we care for, doesn't alienate humans, for example. I think we still have some time until AI beats human in general decision making. And during the time, I believe driving the discourse will get only more important. But in the long run, when AI make decisions better than human, I don't know. Can humans stay in the loop after 5 years? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there are many ways in which AI can contribute today. For example, for deciding between two EIPs or features that we want to implement, I think today it's reasonable to say that AI can give us a pretty good estimation of how hard it's going to be to implement a particular feature and give us some idea of how much work is behind and whether we want to prioritize that or how much these changes break, I don't know, for choice or any specific part of the protocol. and how hard it's going to be to test it. So I think, today or, in 1 year, it's easy to see that AI is going to help us take decisions on which EIPs should be prioritized. Now, whether we really want to take humans completely out of the loop, I'm not convinced yet.
I mean, yeah, as Jihoon was also saying, it might be hard for human beings to really keep up with all the decisions that are being made, or even the thought process for how certain EIPs, their implementation readiness. It might be hard for human beings to really understand what's going on there. I also think that AI can help figure out, a decision in scoping or comparing two different EIPs if it knows the objective, if it knows the goal. But I don't know if necessarily it can arbitrate between two different visions of what Ethereum should maximize for. If AI can really do conflict resolution between two human beings or two stakeholder groups, between two differing visions of what they think Ethereum should be. What is your ultimate vision for what Ethereum should be designed for?
Yeah, the reason I got involved in Ethereum almost a decade ago was because I had this vision of credible neutrality, decentralized platform that could, guide many of the governance, and not only governance aspects of, human beings. I think what we really are trying to build is a technology that implements censorship resistance, that implements everything that we can to make it harder in the future to have autocracies or abuse of power. We want a technology that allow us to remove trust, to remove corruption, therefore, to remove centers of power accumulation, because that's what we see today happening. And that's why I think we're in such a bad shape today, because there are accumulation of power in many, many different places. And what we're trying to build is a technology that perhaps can help us to move a little bit closer to a world that is a little bit more fair, more decentralized, and where there is less abuse of power. But for that, we need to fulfill all the requirements that we mentioned during the call: credible neutrality, decentralization, etc., etc. So this is what we are trying to build, and this is my North Star. This is what, if at some point Ethereum is not that, then probably I will not be interested to work in the protocol anymore.
It's a good perspective. I think mine is also similar. I view blockchain as a technology that can implement the internet native ownership, which is what the internet lacks of today. We don't own things in digital world, even though we spend most of our time there. I think Ethereum is the right candidate to become a substrate that can fill in that gap. And that's what I want to help building the future.
Well, thank you guys so much for those thoughts and those insights, from the CL headliner selection process to just Ethereum at large, what Ethereum is. I'm excited to see what the final decision will be coming out of the ACDC call coming out this Thursday. All of my listeners, you best believe I'm going to be covering it on my newsletter, ACD After Hours. Thank you, everyone who is listening to this episode of Ready for Merge. Please tune in again next week for a new episode and stay ahead of the curve with me on Bitcoin and Ethereum protocol development. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, Christine. Bye-bye.